What kind of front office watches their team get physically destroyed in the paint, outmuscled, out-rebounded, and outworked on their own opening night, and responds by adding another guard, not a forward, not a center, not someone who can absorb contact, protect the rim, or give Aaliyah Boston 30 seconds of rest without the entire defensive structure caving in on itself? A guard number 8 to be exact. And if that number doesn't immediately trigger something in your brain, stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand that this isn't just a bad signing. This is a window into exactly how this organization thinks. And what you see through that window should terrify every single Fever fan alive. Before we go further, drop a comment right now. Do you think Stephanie White survives the full season as head coach? Because by the time we're done here, you're going to have a very strong opinion. I already know what you're going to say. Let's start with the moment the basketball world collectively lost its mind. The developmental contract slot. For weeks, that phrase carried the weight of a promise.
Oh my goodness. Herb Simon. In case you don't know who Herb Simon is, he owns the Indiana Pacers. He also owns the Indiana Fever. You got your ears on, Herb. I understand you're 91 years old. Whoever your handler is, whoever is running the entire basketball operations, something's got to be done. You got to do something about the leadership with the Indiana Fever, the front office, and one Stephanie White.
Fever fans, analysts, and anyone with functioning eye for roster construction have been pointing at the same gaping wound. No front court depth, no interior enforcer, no backup who could protect the paint when Boston needed a breather. The developmental slot was the answer. It was the pressure valve. It was the one move that could patch the most obvious hole in the roster before that hole swallowed the season whole. They used it on a guard. Not only did Indiana already have 7 guards rostered before this signing, but the 5 guards not named Caitlin Clark or Kelsey Mitchell combined for a total of 9 points in a game that went to overtime. 9. You could get 9 points from a determined equipment manager with fresh legs. The math doesn't lie and it doesn't negotiate. This front office looked directly at that math and decided the solution was more the problem. Game over. Here's the thing people keep glossing over when they talk about the opening night loss to Dallas. They keep framing it as a near miss, a heartbreaker, a game the Fever almost had. And sure, on the surface, losing 107-104 in overtime when your 3 stars combined for 73 points sounds like a near miss. But what if it wasn't close at all? What if the final score was actually the most flattering possible version of what happened? A number that masked a structural collapse so severe that no lead would have ever been safe. Because when you watch that game back, you don't see a team that almost won. You see a team propped up by 3 extraordinary individuals carrying a roster that was one substitution away from complete disintegration at any given moment. Caitlin Clark drops 20 and dishes 7. Kelsey Mitchell goes supernova for 30. Aaliyah Boston posts 23 points and 7 assists against the Wings defense that was actively trying to make her irrelevant, and they still lost. That's not a near miss. That's a warning siren. Picture this. It's the 4th quarter. Boston picks up her 4th foul.
Then you heard me say it. Stockton and Malone style. Stephanie White even said Stockton and Malone style. Before she even got hired, I was talking about John Stockton to feeding Karl Malone, and it was deadly. Nobody could stop it. And there has not been a damn thing that showed any team in this league could stop Caitlin Clark feeding Aaliyah Boston. But after 14 games, Stephanie White has said, nah.
White has to pull her. No choice. You protect your franchise cornerstone with a 5th foul lurking. And the moment Boston hits the bench, you can physically feel the air leave the building. Because what walks onto that floor in her place isn't reinforcement. It's a white flag in sneakers. The backup unit didn't just struggle against Dallas's front court. They were dominated, brushed aside, and treated like a speed bump. Dallas's bigs feasted. The paint became an open buffet. And no amount of Caitlin Clark heroics from the perimeter could compensate for what was being surrendered 8 feet from the basket. That's the story of opening night. Not 107 to 104. Not overtime heartbreak. The story is, what happens to this team when Aaliyah Boston can't play? Because here's the part nobody is talking about yet. After that game, Boston didn't jog off the floor normally. She was being evaluated. And what that evaluation reportedly showed changes everything we thought we knew about the urgency of this roster situation. Let's get something straight before we go any further. The Aaliyah Boston injury scare wasn't a minor footnote buried in the post-game notes. It was the earthquake that should have sent this entire front office into emergency mode. Reports coming out of the Fever camp describe Boston as day-to-day, with a lower body issue significant enough to warrant evaluation during the game itself. Day-to-day, on a team with zero front court backup, on a roster that just proved, in 47 minutes of live basketball, that it cannot function without her for even 5 consecutive possessions. If that doesn't reframe the developmental slot signing from questionable to organizational malpractice, nothing will. So here's the question nobody in the mainstream conversation is asking. Who actually made this call and what were they watching? Pull up the film from Saturday night and ignore the box score entirely. Don't look at the final numbers. Look at the tendencies. Look at what Dallas did the moment they realized Indiana's bench unit was on the floor. They didn't adjust their offense. They didn't draw up something clever. They simply attacked the paint every single time because they had scouted this roster and identified the same thing every honest analyst identified in the preseason. The moment Boston rests, Indiana's interior defense becomes suggestion, not a deterrent. Dallas's front court players shot 71% of the rim when matched against Fever reserves. Not only did Indiana's backup bigs fail to protect the paint, there were stretches where Indiana had no true big on the floor at all. A team being physically bullied in its own opener just signed a player who will compete for minutes that were already too crowded. That's not roster management. That's rearranging furniture while the foundation cracks. The 5 reserve players who saw meaningful minutes in that opener combined for 22 points, on efficiency numbers that would embarrass a summer league box score. But here's the part that stings even harder than the production. It wasn't just about scoring. It was about presence, about bodies, about the physical credibility that tells an opposing team they cannot simply walk into the paint and take whatever they want. The Fever's bench had none of that on Saturday, and the signing this week does nothing to change that reality going forward. If what you're hearing right now is making your blood pressure spike, you already know why this channel exists. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this roster situation is going to keep developing, and you're not going to want to be the last person to know what happens next. More is coming. Don't miss it. Here's what separates franchises that reload from franchises that spiral. The best organizations in this league treat their first roster crisis as information. They watch the tape, identify the structural flaw, and move with precision. The Las Vegas Aces, during their championship runs, were relentless about patching weaknesses before those weaknesses became habits. When their front court depth was questioned entering a season, they didn't add guards. They found the bodies, made the uncomfortable cuts, and built a team where no single substitution could unravel everything they constructed. Indiana had that same moment of clarity handed to them on a silver platter after opening night. They looked at it, nodded thoughtfully, and signed a guard. Which brings us to Stephanie White, and the pattern that her most vocal defenders keep refusing to acknowledge. This isn't White's first rodeo with roster imbalance criticism. In her previous stint leading this franchise, the same fundamental tension existed between the talent available and the tactical framework being deployed around it. And the critique was always the same. Player development and roster construction decisions seemed to lag behind where the roster actually needed to go. What's different now is the stakes. What's different now is that Caitlin Clark isn't a developing prospect anymore. She is a proven, fully formed, transcendent basketball talent. And the window to build correctly around her is not unlimited. Every wrong signing tightens that window. Every avoidable loss hardens the skepticism. And somewhere in Indiana right now, there's a free agent, a legitimate frontcourt enforcer still unsigned, still available, still capable of changing the entire calculus of this roster. whose phone has not rung. Yet, here's the twist nobody saw coming. And it's the one thing that might actually save the season before it becomes a eulogy. The Fever situation, as catastrophic as it looks from the outside, is not yet irreversible. The window hasn't slammed shut. It's closing, faster than it should be, faster than any competent front office would allow. But there is still daylight. And understanding why there's still daylight requires you to flip the entire narrative that's been dominating the conversation since that opening night loss. Because the problem with the Fever right now isn't talent. You already know that. The problem is an effort. Boston, Clark, and Mitchell proved that beyond any reasonable argument on Saturday, the problem, the real, fixable, undeniable problem, is a structural mistake being made at the decision-making level. And structural mistakes can be corrected if the people making them are willing to admit they exist. That's the question mark hanging over everything right now. Here's a mistake nobody is naming directly, and it's costing this team more than any single signing or any single loss ever could. The Fever are building this roster around a perimeter identity that only works if the interior is already solved. Let that land for a second. Clark's game is built on space. Her gravity, her shooting range, her ability to manipulate defenses from 30 feet out. All of it is predicated on opposing defenses being stretched thin, unable to collapse the paint because they're terrified of leaving shooters open on the weak side. That system works beautifully when you have a front court presence commanding double teams and demanding interior attention. It works because the threat inside creates the space outside. Without that interior anchor, Clark's gravity weakens. Defenses stop respecting the paint. They drop their bigs, clog the lane, and dare Indiana to beat them through contact they've already proven they cannot absorb. Not only does the offense suffer, but the entire identity of what makes Clark historically unstoppable gets systematically dismantled. Game by game, possession by possession, until casual observers start questioning her instead of the system failing her. And that narrative, once it takes root, is almost impossible to kill. Now here's the bonus insight, the one the mainstream conversation hasn't reached yet. Sources close to the Clark camp have made clear, in carefully chosen public language, that the people around Caitlin understand exactly what's happening. Clark herself, in post-game interviews, has been almost surgically precise in how she praises her teammates while subtly, almost imperceptibly, steering every roster question back toward the same theme. We need more. She's not panicking. She's not throwing anyone under the bus. But she is communicating. To anyone fluent in the language of professional athletes protecting their brand while managing organizational dysfunction, that she sees the problem clearly. A generational talent doesn't spend the first weeks of her sophomore season quietly, repeatedly pointing toward the same roster gap without reason. She's leaving a paper trail. And smart organizations read paper trails before they become headlines. What winning actually requires in the WNBA right now isn't complicated. It never was. Not only does championship caliber depth demand versatility across multiple positions, but the teams hoisting trophies in this league share one non-negotiable trait. They are physically imposing when their stars rest. They don't collapse. They don't become a different team. They bend and hold. The Fever right now break. And the difference between bending and breaking at the roster construction level almost always comes down to 2 or 3 targeted decisions made with clarity and urgency rather than comfort and inertia. 2 or 3 decisions. That's the margin between a season that validates the Clark era and a season that becomes a cautionary tale narrated over highlight reels of what could have been. So here's where we land. And it's not where the outrage merchants want you to land, because outrage doesn't build anything. The Fever have a transformational talent, a legitimate co-star in Mitchell, and a cornerstone in Boston who, when healthy, is as good as any forward in this league. That's not nothing. That's actually a foundation most franchises would sell their future for. What surrounds that foundation right now is the problem. The 8th guard signing isn't the disease. It's a symptom of a deeper diagnostic failure happening at the organizational level. Whether Stephanie White has the authority to fix it, the awareness to demand it, or the political capital to survive long enough to see through, that is the question this season will answer, whether the Fever want it to or not. The window is open. Barely. Somewhere, that frontcourt enforcer's phone is still waiting to ring. The only question left is whether anyone in Indiana is brave enough to dial. This video is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It is not professional sports, financial, or legal advice. Always consult qualified experts before making any decisions.